Hi, I am Sreejata. I'm an artist and a part of artistic collective Revue. Revue is a two-member team of an artist and media practitioners. Revue's artistic practices with regard to urban space are the projects using and combining different media. Revue documents the changes in the city and study how these changes affect people's life. Revue also explores, adapts and creates spaces for public interactions and collective intellectual and creative practices. Right now, I'm sitting in my studio, that is the Revue studio in New Delhi, and trying to connect with you on a virtual platform. We all know that at present we are living in a strange time, confined within the four walls under the lockdown, and it is so tough to meet friends and colleagues. However, I would like to thank all members in FAC for inviting me and giving me an opportunity in this pandemic to be one of the keynote speakers in the FAC Summer School. I thank everybody who would be listening to my talk, taking out some time from their busy schedule in the time of this pandemic. Not only bodies tended to indicate the world beyond themselves, but their movement beyond their own boundaries, a movement of boundary itself, appeared to be quite central to what bodies are. Judith Butler. This presentation describes how through our socially engaged art projects we create narratives about the disenfranchised female body, reclaiming space, public space and moving beyond prescribed and heavily coded socio-cultural boundaries. These boundaries are dominated and controlled via the ceaseless projection and circulation of family, community anxiety about the place, role, functions and duties of women and girls in India. This anxiety is reinforced by sensational media reportage about elopements, adulterous relationships, premarital affairs, sexual misconduct and other instances of women infringing the rigid cultural norms and restrictive customs based on the caste endogamy on the one hand and clan, village, territorial exogamy on the other. The presentation also discusses how our artistic process helps to identify, inscribe and disperse forms of public and private gendered anxiety, including the threat of penalizing for violating social codes through dialogic process that often continuously overlap in an interplay of sound, visuality, visibility, mobility and time. Delhi, with many sprawling and congested working class colonies inhabited by generations of migrants from neighboring rural territory and from other parts of India, have now been subsumed into rapidly transforming metropolitan landscape. While the city thus incorporates and assimilates its margins and redefines its notion of what constitutes the urban, it also deconstructs provincial attitudes, offers a range of new affiliations and new possibilities of personal freedom to the large population of young people in these communities. These localities are the sites of our practice and the public spaces within them became as familiar to us as our own neighborhood. We learned through our locality projects that the community art can express values, enhance a microenvironment, transform a landscape, heighten social awareness, and question hegemonic social and cultural assumptions. It can introduce perspective, reveal what is ever present yet rarely noticed, and at its best collapse the distinction between the ordinary and the extraordinary in our supposed unremarkable, mundane context. Now, what are the sites? I want to talk about the background of the sites which we work. We work in three kinds. Our sites are of three types. One is the several village and one is the resettlement colonies. What are the resettlement colonies? Several villages and slums within the city of Delhi were demolished to make way for posh localities. The residents of these sites were relocated newly built colonies at the periphery of the city. These are resettlement colonies, and they are the new working class clusters. Thousands of people from villages and slums have been uprooted and forced to move to resettlement colonies. Like Dakshinpuri, Kanpur, Lakshminagar, Shashi Garden and other places in peri-urban. Urban villages. There are still few villages all over the city of Delhi as a reminiscence of the old settlements which have cropped up during the different reigns. These villages used to be mostly agricultural land and neighborhood consisted of community of farmers, carpenters, masons, artisans and wage workers. In the old times, in order to make a boundary and to separate it from the agricultural land, the Department of Land Revenue has marked these areas by tying a red thread called Lal Dora in Hindi language around it. Hence, these villages do not fall under the jurisdiction of the municipal authorities or the urban development. Within the transformation of the city, these villages have become the target of either demolition or gentrification. The term Lal Dora, which happened to be applied to both rural and urban villages, slowly is vanishing over the period of time, including the prime areas of Delhi, which today operate commercial and high-end residential areas, though still classified as Lal Dora. The next site is Urdu Park, the Mina Bazar, Jama Masjid. Like any other South Asian cities, Delhi had grown organically through the participation of migrants of different communities and classes. Many of the working class people developed their own site of work and residence through a network of social relationships. Most of the time, these sites are legal or quasi-legal. They often suffer both of violence of demolition due to beautification of the city or through the logic of hygiene. These migrant people are seen as trespassers in the city. One such site is Mina Bazar. It is a makeshift market outside the main gate of Jama Masjid, a Mughal time famous mosque in Old Delhi. The mosque stands opposite side of another spectacular Mughal site called its Red Fort. Every year, these two Mughal monuments attract millions of tourists. Mina Bazar is a location for the working class to buy and sell their products. This is a site for very cheap commodities and food items. Next to the Jama Masjid is one side is Chowri Bazar, which connects the main wholesale market of Delhi, commonly known as Chandni Chowk, but it has several lanes and by-lanes of different names and a dedicated markets for different commodities. This market employs thousands of workers doing all kinds of work from pulling carts or rickshaws, loading, unloading, deliveries and many more activities. Mina Bazar also feeds these people with their daily essentials. While developing a community park is a public art project in collaboration with local youth from the heavily populated working class settlement or the resettlement colony in Dakshinpuri in South Delhi in 2008-2009, we had many informal and formal dialogues with young women and girls about their notions of public spaces. Women belonging to the locality are generally dominated in their home spaces by the men in their families, and in terms of accessing public spaces are the most often restricted to street corners, parks and shops in their own neighborhoods. However, many young women often manage to create their own shared collective spaces on rooftops, terraces, stairwells, at municipal taps and nearby markets, malls and beauty parlors at nodes of community. The horrific gang rape, brutalization and subsequent death from related injuries of young female physiotherapy students in Delhi in December 2012 brought the issue of women's rights and safety to national attention, catalyzing new but controversial legislation with regard to the crime of rape. Our gender-focused artistic research has identified certain key factors contributing to overall lack of safety of women in the urban spaces, including poor lighting, infrastructure, crowded public transport, and heavily aggressively male-dominated public culture. Whether alone in groups, women are continually vulnerable in public spaces, forced to negotiate suggestive gestures, threats, supposedly accidental physical contact, vulgar comments and profanities, and girls are often followed by male stalkers. In general, they neither get sympathy from anyone in the locality or street, nor from the police in the very rare instant that they might actually report the harassment. This leads to girls and young women not only dropping out of school but staying away from particular public spaces, confining themselves to smaller localities in geography of avoidance. However, away from being monitored by family members and neighbors, many young women like to roam beyond these confines. Among young people in Delhi, there is a preference for shared, diverse social space with a sense of physical and affective openness, where there is a possibility at least for interaction with others, but also encapsulated by feeling of security. Based on the context and complexity of each site, our objective is to shape new art forms within given locale nodes and imperatives, as well as to catalyze, release and uncover the aesthetic logic inherent and embedded in the existential matrix of urban communities, each with particular histories, cartographies, demographic, socio-economic patterns and cultural affiliations. In the first phase of the Network Neighborhood project, in the urban village of Khirki and Hosrani, while talking to the young women from the migrant working class background in a session, they described their notions of freedom and the way they try to create their own spaces so that they can experience some social autonomy. For instance, Rani, a teenager from a family of Bihar migrants, says the public in which she is not comfortable is the common terrace. His most comfortable is the common terrace. She finds it the most safe and wonderful place to meet her friends. The girls' general opinion about the Khirki and Hosrani is that though the lanes are dark and congested, they like to go there as often as they can to meet friends, but because it is so crowded, the girls can find ways to evade the vigilant eyes of their sharper ones, and they roam around in their terraces, meeting their fellow friends. In the second phase of the project, engagement with another group of young women from same locality is a documentation of their individual experiences of gender's public space through a series of conversation, writing and drawing. The young people talk about their idea of freedom and how that is suppressed under domination patriarchal ethos. Through the dialogic sessions, they reveal that how anxiety or fear of the family and the community from other is camouflaged with the fear of gender violence in the street. The wild aspirations of freedom, as they write, are young women's hanging out in the street corners with their friends, girls and boys both, socializing, eating with her friends in dhabas, to be able to go out in any time during the daytime and also loiter around the locality at night, Playing football and watching boys playing in the streets of the Haus Rani is one of the most eaten passion. Wearing shorts, hanging around with her friends like the girls in the mall across the road, and driving a motorbike like locality boys riding on a day trip with her brother, making him ride pillion are the wildest dream they could ever imagine. The initial dialogue has extended to the wall through a series of paintings depicting ordinary women doing daily activities and engaging in work that is customarily done by the men in the locality. The intent was to draw men on the street into a dialogue about the gender equality in terms of the acceptance of the women in male associated professions, as well as dialogue about the visibility of the women in public space. The wall painting is a continuous process to reclaim street and public spaces in the locality where the group of young women have transferred the message and the responsibility of this painting as a relay to the next members of the group till date in order to keep it going. Magazine. The intent underlying Mulaqat Lens of Encounter, the magazine, is to create common platform for voices that are lost within the complex cartography and diverse demography in Kirki and Haus Rani. The magazine has increased the presence and visibility for women through inviting local women entrepreneurs to advertise in it, thus spreading the word of their business, services and talents. Women ranging from 28 to 35 years in age, housewives, mothers, working women, small entrepreneurs, eagerly shared their stories. For instance, Bushra, running a tuition center, described how she struggled to build her career as an independent woman through constraints of gender, religion and class. Rajni described her separation from her husband and the pressures of supporting a family on her own. She held on to her aspirations and has opened her own boutique. Zara described the tensions of having to overcome orthodox prejudices both within her home and later her workplace in her journey from teenage years to motherhood. Sunita described how she considered herself equal to men and how in daily life she always relates to them in those terms regardless of male-dominated public sphere. The first issue was in Hindi, but from the second issue onwards the publication has been bilingual to make it accessible to migrants and non-Hindi speaking residents from other communities. Later, the magazine initiative is directed towards stimulating creative thinking and expressions in a shared and open space through reading aloud the narratives in public by Kirki Collective. Even though the magazine launches were carried out on the streets and painting done on the various corners of the locality articulating the presence of women, the cycle rally helped in thrusting our physical presence. Young jubilant women stepped on the street challenging the very setup of the patriarchal systems through their presence, noises, laughs, talks, all in public. Thus breaking the norm of women should be on the streets with a purpose only, they took the street for a leisure ride. Women should be quiet in public and should restrict their emotions, but they laughed, talked, walked, cycled, and were joyous and happy. They let out all emotions flow profusely. The larger overall purpose of the cartography workshop was to document local input with regard to delineating the available public spaces where women may safely socialize within the lens of Kirki, more particular Haus Rani. Other than at beauty parlors, which are public sites yet private interior and usually gender segregated zone, it is rarely possible for women to congregate and interact freely. In the spirit of the discourse of power in representational spaces, there have been also attempts to explore and reimagine the urban spatiality through the map-making sessions. The idea to explore and construct an alternative to the cartographer's imagination, which has taken in various forms. The cartography stations also map the foodscapes of the neighborhood, which traces the multiple nonsenses of street life and how it shapes the nature of interaction with space around. Ruxana, on her daily commute to work on the foot through the winding alleys of neighborhood, finds the voices comforting and gives her strength to reach to the end of the neighborhood where she runs a small canteen. The lanes and bylines of village, Khirki and Hosrani are together with the historical dominated by the Mayo Muslim families and within the influx of the migrant community from Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, East and Northeast India, and the refugees from Multan during partition of India and at the present Afghanistan, Iraq and African countries, have brought a diverse cosmopolitan in terms of food as socio-cultural practice. This foodscape has reflected on how Khirki and Hosrani has transformed slowly in terms of its culinary spaces over the last few years, with opening up of new joints offering food prepared by the migrants, internal and international. A girl from Manipur can be seen enjoying an Afghani burger on the streets, or an Afghan teenage girl could be seen relishing the golgappas from a vendor. The interaction between the multiple forms of food consumption practices had made the neighborhoods an interesting display of mutating food habits. The Museum of Food, a living heritage project, is a manifestation of cartography stations by the Khirki Collective. The project Museum of Food a community kitchen, has connected migrant women from the same village, Khirki and Hosrani, an area full of small eateries catering to large diverse local demographic and to refugee families from Iraq, Afghanistan and various African countries. The kitchen project focuses on enabling the creation of dynamic network of social relationships and friendships through the daily act of cooking a wide range of traditional food in a common kitchen, sharing recipes, meals and enabling the creation of food archive, food maps and pop-up kitchens. The process of cooking offers different possibilities on the basis of one's social identity. The local migrants, especially the ones rooted off their native places, carry food practices as one of their defining identities to the new place. This explains the growth of places serving different cuisines in the cities across the world, which have been streams of local and international migrants. In this context, the idea of exchanges through food forms an essential component of our social bonds. The Project Museum of Food brings these multiple food practices in a common space through a simple yet layered act of cooking. The agents of exchange in these are the women who have socially and culturally bounded in the kitchen owing to the larger patriarchal setup. The relation is not restricted to the act of cooking, but also consists of stories that are hidden in the selection of ingredients, the role of their mothers in sharing the age-old recipes, the range of utensils, etc. They are a living museum of their cultural practices and habits that they have inculcated over the years. The Living Lab was started with an intention of providing a space for these stories around food and the process of preparation to unfold and build a community of women from diverse backgrounds sharing their practices over a period of time through the act of cooking. The method at the lab is to rotate the task of food preparation, that is to have one dish from each cuisine tradition cooked daily, often focusing on common ingredient or a theme, and then to present these dishes collectively at a monthly pop-up kitchen at different site when local people are invited to share the meal and encouraged to interact with the project. This mode of engagement cohesively brings the different food traditions together both within the familiar intimate space of the kitchen and the wider context of general public. Within the pragmatic discussion about the particular traditional foods seamlessly expand into wider narratives about displacement, migration and memory, and how these variables compel resettled families to unwillingly adapt new food habits, occasionally give up old ones, and adapt embedded hereditary culinary customs to new realities. The women in the kitchen daily prepare food, exchange recipes, discover new uses of traditional and Indian ingredients in the kitchen. Such communication also enables them to share personal recollections of their families, relatives, and their home social life in the diverse places of origin and environments of the kitchens they left behind upon migration, the practices, the protocols, habits around their traditional foods that they seem to treasure as a natural, tangible form of personal and cultural inheritance. In symbolic terms, it might be well asserted that within the unique ethos of empowered polyglot sociality and community, it is traditional food culture that serves as the strong, singular, definite mother tongue of all those participating in the kitchen in Kirki. Not all collaborators speak each other's language, yet are able to actively communicate vis-a-vis essential cooking information as well as transmit their emotional experiences associated with their traditional foods. The project has given these women a sense of belonging in a foreign country and helped them to reaffirm their identities, subjectivities through the intimate act of food preparation and eating together, and giving them the opportunity to make a space for leisure of their own. Night shelter is another site of our engagement, and this night shelter for homeless women occupying a section of Urdu Park, a large field next to the archaeological heritage site of Jama Masjid in Old Delhi. It engages in an aesthetic and conceptual exploration of the collaborators' experience of public-private spaces within the resident single mothers who are beggars, victims of domestic violence and abduction and other kinds of abuses. In the project Axial Merging, with some in-depth experience of collaborative work for more than a couple of years through various engagements like diaper making, pillow making, painting on interior of the shelter wall, collaborators then undertook a more elaborate exploration of the idea of map making as a way to narrate their experiences of their environment. Their interest in this modality became more urgent when agencies in charge of the shelter proposed moving this shelter from its present site in the heart of Old Delhi to a place outside the city. This caused much anxiety among the shelter residents, many of whom have deep, reliable, and in some cases lifelong relationship with Jama Masjid and Mina Bazar. This particular context embedded in the women's personal history, continuing to be the pulse of their daily lives. The women collaboratively created a map of locality with acrylic paints on single canvas of 16 feet or 4 feet, a unique form of existential cartography since the women's prolonged experience of this area is so intimately infused with their material psychological survival. Each collaborator also painted personal impressions of Mina Bazar on individual canvases depicting the shop's lens, objects sold there such as sleepers and bags. While painting, they orally reflected on their complex, intricate relationship with the surrounding environment, acknowledging its presence as a redemptive, stable feature within their frequently chaotic, fluctuating, and highly stressed circumstances. From the inception of the project, while building a relationship with these single mothers, we have been continuously observing a crucial lack of adequate food supplies and arrangements for the medical care for the residents of the shelter. There are several government-run social services programs who were providing shelter residents with 3 meals a day. This discontinued for some reason for some time. The women then began cooking themselves in the courtyard of the shelter. They made a rudimentary stove by placing 2 bricks in parallel, between which sticks or other wood and waste papers could be burnt as fuel. The residents buy ingredients from the vegetable market, fish and meat market, and a particular grocery shop that gives them item on credit. They also obtain leftover food from various local dhabas, that is the restaurants, roadside eateries. Despite these daily efforts, at times they do not have enough for proper meal and can only feed their children biscuits of bread with a tea for lunch and dinner sometimes. While working on the large collaborative map of the locality, women delimited the shops where they regularly get food, tea, ingredients. This visual narrative enabled a parallel map of their social networks in the neighborhood. The women's stay is not complete without wider interaction in the community, going out of Urdu Park into the market on their morning mission to procure ingredients and food for the day's meal, and chatting to each other and to the people around Lala's grocery shop, Kalim's dhaba, Bihari dhaba, Bengali dhaba. Sometimes they start the day with a breakfast of tea, fan-shaped biscuits from Ustad's shop or number 18 tea stall. The collaborators develop personal narratives in more depth through exploring the relationship of their food, cooking practices and their environment. This resulted in the production of recipe books based on the discussion of food traditions of the communities in which the participants were raised, where how they learned to cook and how they have adapted their cooking techniques and philosophies of food to the available ingredients, available money exigencies of life in the shelter. Each collaborator created her own recipe books with paints, collages made from colored paper and sequences. The personal memories are, while they were making these recipes, they talked about their favorite foods. In some cases, they had not eaten for a long time after migrating to city from rural areas. For instance, Sabrun recalled the dish she most loved, makai chawal, that is the corn rice, that she last ate in her village as a child. Corn was a major crop in her region. So, corn rice and these were the staple in their local diet. Sabrun spoke of becoming an orphan when she was very young and being raised by a strict and demanding aunt. One day, instead of tending to the pot of makai chawal on the stove, Sabrun left the kitchen to play in the courtyard. The food got burnt and her aunt punished her by making her eat all of it. At present, Sabrun has support of a man who is a kind of temporary partner who ensures 2 daily meals for her, but he is reluctant to feed her children even while he wants her to be with him and cook for him. She does cook makai chawal today, but uses different methods from the one she learned from her aunt. The collaborators also talked about their good relationships with the shopkeepers at the particular stalls in Manabazar, where they buy their ingredients, as well as with the dhaba owners who support them by giving them food on trust, accepting payment later. The women rely on this generosity. For example, Binu explained that when they buy a 10 rupee plate of dal chawal, that is lentil rice, from Kalim and ask for an extra helping in form of meat gravy, he adds a boti, a small piece of meat, to the gravy. Bihari, another dhaba owner who has known the residents of the shelter for a long time, does the same when they buy the dal chawal from him. As mentioned earlier, the shelter residents used to cook on a makeshift stove made of bricks using wood and waste paper as a fuel. Now they cook on gas, getting their cylinder refilled at Kala Mahal, as the owner takes rupees 80 to refill, while Lalaji near the fish market charges an extra rupees 10 for his effort. The women used to buy their utensils from Kala Mahal, but now they buy them from the Sunday market. The collaborative creation of the map of the Meena Bazaar had inspired the idea of shared kitchen for some time. The collaborators had been discussing how to pool their limited resources acquired with great difficulty towards cooking meals in the courtyard of the shelter and selling this food as a source of income. An option to their normative practice of earning through begging and a form of work that would enable them to maintain their dignity. Through the project, we observe that sustained and systematic creative engagement has catalyzed profound and positive shifts in collaborative sense of self and identity. They no longer see themselves as struggling, destitute individuals, primarily concerned with their children's daily survival in extremely difficult conditions. While their material hardship continues, their psychological horizons seem to have radically expanded, and they now affirm themselves as emerging artists with valid voices, valid perspectives, valid subjectivities, valid symbolic languages, valid skills, and above all a valid space within a social system of unconscionable inequality. Their work, objective canvases, maps, text, food is displayed and experienced within their shelter during the project's open days. That living space itself undergoes a dynamic metamorphosis into a truly alternative exhibition venue far beyond the conventional boundaries of canonized institutions such as galleries and museums. This corroborates our aesthetic philosophy and organic mode of research over the past decade, part of our effort to embed a strongly democratic, inclusive template within the generally closed elitist ethos of contemporary Indian art. With the complete destruction of Meena Bazaar last year around October, the women of the Urdu Park shelter have lost the bustling environment that was in itself a nurturing refuge for them in so many ways. They are still coming to terms with the stark, disorienting, haunting of sin they encounter each time they leave the shelter compound. The social connection within the now empty greed of the demolished market still exists, but are ruptured, enfeebled, and elusive. Nobody knows when the shelter may itself be targeted for demolition within uncompromising myopic municipal agendas of beautification, urban development, and the profit-driven mandates of a global city. The once throbbing metrics of Meena Bazaar now exist as a site in the collaborators' history, memories, and hearts, and is being celebrated and commemorated through their text and paintings. Especially during the time of pandemic recently, when the migrant workers who found Meena Bazaar, the wholesale market, as their permanent home, are being forced to leave on starvation for days and are destined for an uncertain future. However, the women's creative work and the personal commentary in effect now constitute an invaluable archive that memorizes and honors what once was a thriving material and social space. Its many microecologies supporting many thousands of people and interwoven into a dynamic way of life. Perhaps such inscription is also the most appropriate, immediate, and meaningful way to mourn, to negotiate the shock and grief at the death of a context that was so precious, such an intense, reliable, and significant variable in the daily push to survive. Our observations. The discourse of risk vulnerability that frames the way disenfranchised body of all ages and backgrounds routinely experience the violence, aggression in cities' public spaces continues to confirm the urgent need for all levels and modes of intervention. Activists demand justice in the domains of gender inequality, sexual assault and harassment, violence against racial, sexual and ethnic minorities, refugees and asylum seekers across the globe. However, this discourse is often contextually manipulated and subsumed by other discourses imposed and enforced by the state and its actors, supporters and instruments. For instance, in December 2012, when thousands of citizens, men and women, marched through the streets of Delhi in non-violent protest against the gruesome gang rape and subsequent death of the young physiotherapy students and Nirbhaya, the protesters were accused of disrupting law and order and had to repeatedly confront police blockades, water cannons, etc. More recently, in December 2019, Shaheen Bagh, an underprivileged area in southeast Delhi, saw large numbers of women from conservative households transgress deep socio-religious codes to claim public space and create a unique sit-in protesting the Citizen Amendment Act, a newly passed law that allegedly discriminates against religious minorities. These women occupied a local road around the clock in all weathers with strong support from people from all walks of life. Shaheen Bagh inspired similar CAA protests all over India and drew worldwide attention, even as it continued to be subject to the strong government threats of eviction and legal appeals to clear the road for traffic and endured state surveillance and police containment. Another dramatic example of the continuing disenfranchisement of disenfranchised body all over India was the way the many millions of migrant workers who leave their villages to find work in the cities were more or less abandoned by the Indian state during the recent national coronavirus lockdowns. The state made little or no provision for the survival of these innumerable bodies that are the heart of the Indian economy. Jobless, evicted, hungry, exhausted, sick and relying for food and other help on NGOs and compassion of more fortunate citizens, millions and migrants including pregnant women and children left the government-run camps, shelters and other places they were forced into during the lockdown and began to walk home to their distant villages, often many hundred kilometers. Another recent instance of the lethal disenfranchisement of a disenfranchised body that has similarly become worldwide news is the unconscionable public murder by police of George Floyd, an unarmed African American in Minneapolis last month. This gruesome killing filmed in real time on mobile phones by the direct witnesses and instantly circulated on social media all over the globe, has intensified the ongoing activism of Black Lives Matter, a contemporary movement of American citizens protesting racial injustice and entrenched police violence against the civilians. The enraged discourse of activism, social justice now confronts the militarized state discourse of law and order and the mass protests surrounding the death of George Floyd. Such interventions aimed at political transformation with race and gender justice campaigns using public spaces to challenge the status quo and raise issues of safety, autonomy, mobility of the disenfranchised bodies in those very spaces. However, it is a fact that mass protests initially fueled by the high energy of social anger, moral outrage and a desire for permanent, equitable change are difficult to sustain. And when tactically subsumed by state discourses, may flatten out altogether. We have no idea what happened to the courageous women of Shaheen Bagh after the CAA protest site was dismantled due to the coronavirus mandate. Nor is there any way to know whether the huge numbers of men who protested the Nirbhaya atrocity were able to successfully reject the general conditioning of male privilege and patriarchal conservatism that so easily distorts into the repugnant logic of toxic masculinity and misogyny. Returning from the national international frames of reference to the local frameworks in which our socially engaged art practice is embedded, we reiterated here that our core method is that of sustained dialogic engagements within the everyday realities of certain material sites in underprivileged urban neighborhoods. Through reliable presence, dialogue, and creative activities in a local public spaces, we as a collective aim to gradually push the boundaries of social cultural acceptance and emphasize the awareness of the need to respect the disenfranchised bodies as valid signifiers of the identity, ethnicity, and particular affiliations. In wider terms, our attempt is to organically deconstruct seemingly interactable phobia and prejudice, and through our ACA or socially engaged art interventions create possibilities for every person to use public space with equal freedom and enfranchisement. Thank you.
يا كاس العمر ما ظلت وش بيك ويا جرحي ليش وقت تنزيف وش بيك يا كاس العمر ما ظلت وش بيك ويا جرحي ليش وقت تنزيف وش بيك وهو سبب كل الصار بيا يا ويل